Thomas Brannan had never planned on slowing down, not even after stepping away from the executive board of the meat supply company he had spent over 3 decades building from the ground up. While others fantasized about white sand beaches or mountain cabins with uninterrupted silence, Thomas found his comfort in smoke. Thick, aromatic, wood-fed smoke that curled around brisket like a second skin. For years, he had been too busy to indulge the deep-rooted love he had for the old-world craft of meat smoking. It wasn't just about cooking. It was about history, about the tactile, sacred ritual of turning raw cuts into something transcendent, using fire, patience, and time. That kind of transformation wasn't foreign to Thomas. He had spent a lifetime transforming pressure into value, setbacks into strategy. But now, in the quiet of his well-earned retirement, he wanted to do it on his terms and in his own backyard. He chose Lakewood Shores precisely because of its promises: clean landscaping, slow-rolling hills, and a polished lakefront encircled by modern homes designed for people who had, like him, earned the right to sit still if they wanted. It wasn't just scenic, it was deliberate. Nothing about the neighborhood was accidental. The mailboxes all matched, the grass was cut to uniform lengths, and the homes looked like they'd been approved by committee before the first brick was ever laid. Thomas found this satisfying at first. He wasn't looking for chaos or spontaneity. He'd had enough of both in his former life. What he wanted now was a place where he could cook in peace, think without distraction, and maybe, just maybe, enjoy the company of friends without constantly glancing at the clock. Within the first month of settling in, Thomas had already made alterations to the backyard. He had a specialized concrete slab poured beside the patio, built a semi-enclosed outdoor kitchen, and installed a tall steel smoker custom-built by a friend in Houston who owed him a favor from years back. The smoker was no toy. It was a serious piece of equipment capable of managing 3 full briskets, several racks of ribs, and a load of sausages in one session. It was designed for slow-burning oak and mesquite, with a vertical draw system and a smoke control valve that Thomas himself had helped engineer. For him, this wasn't a grill to flip burgers over, it was a shrine. And like all shrines, it was meant to be visited, respected, and, most importantly, used. The first evening he fired it up, the air around the yard filled with the unmistakable scent of meat and wood, a rich, earthy smell that stirred something primal even in the most modern soul. He didn't throw a party. He didn't even send out invites. A few old friends from his supply chain days had stopped by to see the new setup, and Thomas figured it would be rude not to put something on. The drinks were casual, the stories familiar, and the smoke, it was perfect. For the first time in years, Thomas felt anchored. He wasn't selling anything, pitching anyone, or keeping an eye on quarterly metrics. He was feeding people. That was enough. But Lakewood Shores had its own undercurrents, and Thomas noticed them quickly. The first indication came not from a neighbor, but from a paper, neatly folded and stuck into his mailbox with no postage, no return address, just a printed sheet clipped from the community rulebook with one paragraph circled in. Red ink. Outdoor cooking appliances must not emit excessive odor or smoke that may be deemed a nuisance to neighboring properties. No signature, no direct accusation, just a rule, highlighted like a whispered warning. He chuckled at first. He'd seen real corporate threats, real legal maneuvering. This was amateur hour by comparison. Still, he took the paper inside, placed it in the drawer next to his spice rubs, and forgot about it. Except he couldn't. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This time it was formal, bearing the crest of the Lakewood Committee for Neighborhood Harmony. It referred to a formal complaint made by an anonymous resident regarding smoke and particulate odor exceeding neighborhood standards. A fine of $100 was enclosed with instructions to cease all outdoor cooking involving smoke-generating fuel. Sources. Thomas blinked at the wording. particulate odor. Who wrote this? A food critic turned bureaucrat. He folded the letter calmly and placed it beside the first. Then he did what he'd always done when confronted with vague opposition. He kept moving forward. Over the next week, he continued to cook, though less frequently and only during daylight hours. But the fines kept coming. Each time, the wording grew more specific. Extended exposure to meat-related vapors. Complaints of throat discomfort from neighboring properties. Threat of escalation to county code enforcement. It was absurd, and yet he felt the tension tightening. He wasn't running a business. He wasn't advertising. He was simply preparing food on his own land, using legal equipment and adhering to every fire safety requirement the county had ever issued. But logic had stopped mattering. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. And someone clearly didn't like the scent of Thomas Brannan claiming space. He began noticing other things. Conversations with previously friendly neighbors grew short. One man who had borrowed his ladder a week earlier now refused eye contact during their morning walks. A woman who once complimented the aroma of slow-cooked ribs was now posting vaguely passive-aggressive messages on the neighborhood forum about the dangers of prolonged exposure to air pollutants. Thomas had lived long enough to know when the tide was turning. This wasn't one complaint. This was a campaign. Subtle, strategic, designed not to confront him directly but to pressure him into compliance through isolation and bureaucracy. He didn't take it personally, at least not at first. But the smell of smoke, which had once brought him comfort, now seemed to carry accusation with every curl of vapor. What disturbed him more than the fines or the letters was the realization that someone had a deeper stake in getting rid of him, or, at the very least, getting rid of his smoker. The rules weren't being enforced evenly. He saw other homes with grills, fireplaces, even fire pits that occasionally sent up plumes of hickory-scented air. None of them were getting targeted. He began to wonder, was it the smoker itself, or was it him? Thomas didn't react rashly. That wasn't his nature. He had survived economic crashes, hostile boardrooms, and a near breakdown in the mid-2000s when their supply lines collapsed due to cross-border tariffs. What he knew was this: you don't escalate without intel, and you don't counterattack unless you're certain of the ground beneath your feet. He began collecting everything. Every notice, every letter, every timestamp. He started taking brief notes on which neighbors stopped speaking to him and when. And quietly, with the calmness of a man who had no need to prove himself, he started asking questions, not to the residents, but to people who knew how land was managed, how bylaws were enforced, and how real power operated in places like Lakewood, Shores. He wasn't angry yet, but he was curious, and curiosity, when paired with experience, rarely ends quietly. The first time Thomas truly sensed the ground shifting beneath him, it wasn't from another letter, but from silence. Not the comfortable kind that accompanies a warm evening and the faint hiss of wood crackling beneath meat, but the calculated cold quiet of a neighborhood watching you and waiting for you to flinch. The usual banter at the mailbox had gone still. Even the dog walkers passed his driveway just a little faster than before, heads tilted toward their leashes, suddenly uninterested in the scent of hickory that still clung to the air despite his best efforts to minimize smoke. And when his Thursday morning began, not with birdsong but with a knock at the door, followed by the sharp uniform of a county compliance officer, Thomas knew things had officially moved beyond passive resistance. The officer, young, polite, but clearly uncomfortable, stood on the porch with a clipboard clutched too tightly in one hand and a county-issued camera slung across his chest. He explained that a formal investigation had been opened based on multiple environmental disturbance filings from within the neighborhood. He wasn't accusatory, at least not directly, but there was a rehearsed rhythm to his words, a bureaucratic cadence Thomas recognized immediately. This wasn't about finding facts. This was about completing a process, one designed to document the inevitable, regardless of what truth might live beneath the surface. The officer took photos of the smoker, of the woodpile, even of the grease trap, which Thomas kept meticulously clean. He asked about fire safety protocols which Thomas had in place and could cite from memory, and in return the officer nodded and scribbled meaningless notes, the kind that never changed the outcome but justified the next step. That evening, Thomas reviewed the inspection summary that had been emailed to him within hours of the visit. The language was vague but ominous. Pending determination. Potential code infraction. Subject to revision upon neighborhood regulatory review. There was no citation yet, no fine, but the implication was clear. A threshold had been crossed, and someone had successfully weaponized the system. This wasn't about the smell anymore. This was about eliminating him as a variable. By the end of that week, he received another envelope, hand-delivered with no stamp and no signature. Just a note folded inside that read, "We hope you consider the health of our community. Please show some respect and relocate your activities accordingly." There was no threat, no profanity, nothing overtly hostile, just the suffocating tone of entitlement disguised as moral authority. He knew that voice. He'd heard it in boardrooms when competitors acted like they were protecting the industry while gutting smaller operations and backroom deals. He'd heard it in regulatory panels when lobbyists used the language of safety to strangle competition. It was the voice of someone who believed the rules should serve them, and that anyone who resisted was simply uncivilized. But it wasn't until the following Tuesday that things truly turned from unsettling to outright calculated. Thomas had just returned from a routine supply trip. Mesquite from a vendor he'd known for years. A special chili rub he'd ordered from a family-run shop in New Mexico. He parked in the driveway, carried his bags to the porch, and paused only when he noticed something strange on the concrete beneath the smoker. A line, thin, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, of dark powder traced a half-circle around the smoker's base. It hadn't been there before. He crouched down, dipped a finger into the residue, brought it to his nose. Ash, maybe, but mixed with something sharper, synthetic, industrial. It wasn't accidental. He scanned the yard. The gates were locked. No signs of forced entry, no broken latches or disturbed earth. Yet someone had entered. Someone careful enough to leave no prints and no trace beyond that line. A message, not of violence, but of surveillance. You're not untouchable, it seemed to say. You can be reached. And that, more than the letters, the fines, the cold shoulders, was what got to him. They hadn't confronted him directly because they didn't have to. They were embedding doubt, fear, suspicion. They wanted him rattled. Thomas didn't panic. He responded the way any seasoned strategist would, with precision. He called his attorney the next morning. Not the business lawyer he'd used for contracts and mergers, but a property specialist named Elise Kern, who had once helped him navigate a zoning dispute with a city trying to condemn land for a shopping center. Elise was sharp, direct, and uninterested in drama. She listened quietly as he laid out everything. The letters, the inspections, the residue. When he finished, she asked only one question. "Do you want this to go away, or do you want to fight?" "I want to understand who's behind it," Thomas said calmly. "Then I want to take away whatever leverage they think they have." Elise went to work immediately. Within days, she'd pulled the meeting minutes from the last 6 months of neighborhood committee gatherings. Buried within them were small references to community air quality discussions, nuisance reduction initiatives, and, most revealingly, a bullet point entry noting discussions with external parties regarding land use near Lakeview Path. That meant partnerships, deals. Someone wasn't just annoyed by the smoke, they wanted the area cleared or neutralized for something else. Elise also discovered that the property adjacent to Thomas's backyard, A thin strip of undeveloped green space that bordered the lake and connected to several lots was recently reclassified from passive recreational land to pending community redevelopment. That opened the door to manipulation. It was Elise who finally connected the name, Karen Merritt. A name Thomas had heard in passing but never considered a threat. She wasn't on the neighborhood board, but she was adjacent to it, financially, socially, and in influence. She owned a growing chain of upscale plant-based cafes and had recently begun investing in ecological lifestyle communities, a term Thomas found insufferable in its vagueness. She had acquired a few properties near the Green Strip and was quietly lobbying to rezone the area into a pedestrian-only wellness loop, including yoga spaces, art installations, and, most tellingly, a full prohibition on carbon-heavy outdoor cooking practices. She wasn't just trying to stop Thomas. She was trying to erase him as a concept. His smoker wasn't an appliance, it was an ideological threat. Elise, ever the pragmatist, laid out the options. He could go to court, file for injunctive relief, challenge the fines as selectively enforced, even demand a formal investigation into land use ethics. But the process would be slow, and it would paint him as combative. Or he could do something else, something surgical. Thomas didn't decide immediately. He thought, walked the property, stood in the late afternoon sun and watched the lake as it caught gold at its edges. Then he looked toward the strip of land Karen was hoping to transform into a sterile, curated monument to sanitized living. It was barely used, overgrown in parts, neglected in others. Forgotten, really, but legally open to acquisition. He didn't need to fight her on her terms. He could outflank her on his. That night, he placed a call to an old contact, someone who handled land transactions for agricultural zoning, someone discreet. And as the smoke from his last legal brisket curled into the twilight, Thomas didn't feel defeated. He felt focused. The acquisition itself was straightforward. The land in question, long neglected and overlooked, had been categorized under a transitional municipal use clause, meaning it was open to petition transfer if a proposal for community-appropriate activation could be filed and funded by a private party, with Elise handling the documentation and his contact from the Agricultural Zoning Office quietly facilitating the necessary groundwork. Thomas submitted a proposal not as a private homeowner, but under a limited foundation he'd once established to support culinary education programs. The paperwork referred to the project as a public-facing heritage smokehouse garden, framed around cultural preservation, sustainable food practices, and local economic engagement. It was bureaucratically bulletproof and emotionally irresistible. Exactly what was needed to push it through without triggering any obvious alarms in Karen Merritt's camp. Within 3 weeks, the purchase was finalized. He owned the land, not the back of it, not the easement, all of it. The grassy, tangled ribbon that connected several luxury properties to the lake and served as the backbone of Merritt's proposed eco-walk was now in his hands. He did not announce it. He did not gloat. He didn't even put up a sign. He simply broke ground. The first structure that went up wasn't the smoke wall. That came later. First came a series of narrow, raised planting beds lined in reclaimed cedar, filled with herbs traditionally used in smoke-based preservation: bay, rosemary, lavender, mustard seed. Then came 3 stone benches carved with food history quotes. Subtle, deliberate touches, nothing aggressive, nothing that could be easily protested. Just the slow, careful shaping of space into a narrative that didn't include kale smoothies and eucalyptus meditation stones. When neighbors asked, Thomas described it plainly: a culinary heritage park, open to the public by invitation, eventually by reservation. Educational programming was planned. Small-batch demos, art collaborations. He offered the most neutral, inviting version of the truth, all while keeping the true backbone of the project quiet An integrated wall of hybrid brick and steel smokers lined across the central corridor of the property, each vented, regulated, and compliant with every conceivable code. Not mere cookers, but monuments to smoke, each one engineered to maximize thermal efficiency and reduce particulate output, fitted with embedded dampening systems and precision sensors. It was an ode to the tradition Karen was so determined to erase. Construction continued without issue until the day the first letter arrived, not addressed to him, but to the city. A formal complaint alleging improper zoning use, backed by environmental concern. The complainant was not named, but Elise confirmed through her channels that it was Karen's legal team who had submitted it. Within 48 hours, a second letter followed, this one demanding a temporary stop order while the nature of the build was reviewed. Elise had expected this and had already prepared a formal rebuttal, complete with documentation of the project's compliance and letters of support from minor historical culinary associations who had jumped at the chance to be affiliated with something so unique the stop order was denied. Thomas knew that would be the moment things stopped being subtle. Karen had operated through indirection for months, committees, whispers, pressure, but now she had stepped into the ring with her name tied to a paper trail. That meant her veneer was slipping. It meant she was irritated, and irritated people made mistakes. The very next day, Thomas came home to find a row of his raised beds overturned. Nothing else was damaged, no signs of a struggle, no broken locks. But the lavender was trampled, and the rosemary had been dug up and left in a pile like discarded weeds. It wasn't vandalism for the sake of destruction. It was targeted, surgical, aimed at the symbolic entry point of the space. He filed a report, yes, but he didn't expect the police to do anything. What mattered was that someone had crossed the line physically now. The message had changed from, "You're not wanted," to, "You should be afraid." But fear, for Thomas, had never been a motivating factor. Calculation was. The day after the beds were destroyed, he made a phone call to a design consultant, an architectural planner who specialized in experiential spaces. Together, they developed the final design for what would become the wall itself, a curved formation of individual smoking chambers, each embedded with brass plaques listing regional wood types and traditional cuts used across different American communities: Texan oak, Carolina hickory, Appalachian applewood. Between each unit, narrow vertical gardens grew herbs and climbing peppers. Beneath each chamber, reinforced drainage beds caught all runoff. Above them, a narrow steel canopy offered shade and, more importantly, controlled airflow. The structure was part installation, part altar, part culinary classroom. No one could call it a private grill. No one could call it a nuisance. It was too public, too documented, too integrated into its purpose. When the first smoke rose from the wall, it did so quietly. There was no grand opening, no press, just a low, steady ribbon of oak that curled into the air like an exhale. A few neighbors came by, not many. One was a woman who had stopped talking to him months ago. She didn't speak when she arrived, just nodded, accepted the paper plate he handed her, and sat near the rosemary beds. Others followed. Not all, not even most, but enough. That weekend, Thomas received his first in-person confrontation. It wasn't dramatic. No yelling, no threats. Karen showed up in a pale linen jacket and matching flats, clipboard in hand, expression perfectly neutral. She stood at the edge of the property, just beyond the boundary stones he had set, and waited until he noticed her. When he did, he approached slowly, carefully, not to intimidate, just to clarify terms. She spoke first. "This project is in direct violation of community design objectives," she said calmly, eyes never leaving his. "It undermines planned redevelopment and contradicts the values we're trying to instill here." Thomas didn't respond at first. He let her speak. She continued, laying out her complaints in precise, rehearsed language about air quality, aesthetics, property values, cultural direction. She didn't mention her businesses. She didn't need to. That was the unspoken core of it all. Thomas's smoke didn't just challenge her vision. It challenged her profit model, her branding, her carefully cultivated future. When she finished, Thomas finally replied, equally calm. "This land was unused for a decade. I turned it into something. That's not violation. It's contribution. If it contradicts your values, maybe you should reconsider what they're based on." Karen's jaw tightened, just slightly. "You're going to lose support." "I don't need support," he said. "I need integrity." And with that, he walked back toward the wall. The smoke was still rising, faint but steady. By that evening, the neighborhood forum was ablaze with passive-aggressive posts about unregulated culinary performances, about the danger of celebrating obsolete traditions. But Thomas didn't engage. The wall wasn't for debate. It was action, and the real escalation had only just begun. Thomas never expected the project to remain untouched forever. Success, even quiet success, was often the most dangerous signal in any conflict. It attracted scrutiny, invited sabotage, and exposed the true motives of those who had previously operated under the guise of concern. By the time the third weekend rolled around and the smoker wall had hosted a modest but steady flow of neighbors, curious chefs, and local history buffs, he could feel the shift in atmosphere not just around his property, but throughout the neighborhood. It wasn't celebration. It was something colder, organized discomfort, subtle but surgical detachment, the kind that didn't yell or threaten but instead pressed in with regulations, review boards, and requests for procedural clarity that carried the sheen of legitimacy but none of its fairness. Karen had gone silent in person, but her reach had grown louder. Anonymous requests began to flow through the city's digital complaint system. Fire hazard accusations, noise reports that described events that had never occurred, one even claiming the smoker wall had been illegally connected to underground propane lines, despite Thomas using nothing but traditional hardwoods. Elise remained steady throughout, filing responses, collecting timestamps, demanding documentation, and quietly ensuring that no investigation went unchallenged. But Thomas could sense she was preparing for something bigger. The volume, the pace, the precision of the accusations, it all pointed toward escalation. Not random harassment, but a coordinated buildup toward something public, something designed to make him look reckless, selfish, or worse, outdated. Then the flyer appeared, folded into mailboxes, slipped under windshields, tacked near the community mailbox where joggers and dog walkers paused in the early hours. It was printed on heavy stock, tasteful serif font, minimal color. It read like an invitation, but it wasn't. Preserving Progress, a community conversation about air, tradition, and the future of Lakewood shores. Beneath the title was a list of panel participants: a local environmental professor, a pediatric asthma specialist, a representative from the EU County Zoning Office, and, most notably, Karen Merritt herself, billed not as a business owner but as a community impact advocate. The event was scheduled for the following Thursday evening, to be held in the public hall adjacent to the lake. No mention of Thomas by name, no direct reference to his smoker wall, but the implication was undeniable. He wasn't being asked to participate. He was being put on trial. Elise advised him not to attend. "You don't walk into a tribunal when the verdict's already written," she said bluntly, "especially not when it's staged for optics." But Thomas couldn't ignore it. Not because he wanted to defend himself in public, and certainly not because he hoped to persuade anyone. He went because he needed to see it, the structure of it, the choreography, the way this battle was being translated for public consumption. And so he sat near the back, wearing a dark jacket, his presence quiet, unannounced. No one greeted him. A few recognized him, glanced, then quickly turned their attention forward, He didn't mind. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there to see. The panel was exactly what he expected. Karen opened with a polished speech about inclusive ecosystems and post-carbon neighborhood development. The professor followed with vague statistics about airborne particulates and how food-based emissions were often overlooked in environmental policies. The doctor gave a moving, if not entirely connected, testimony about childhood asthma rates, and then the zoning representative delivered a vague, non-committal response about reviewing permissible use codes in upcoming sessions. At no point was the smoker wall named. At no point was Thomas addressed. And yet, the wall was in every sentence, behind every pause, between every line. The message was clear. There is a movement here. Progress, harmony, and anyone who questions it, even with brisket, is an obstacle. It wasn't until the floor was opened for questions that Thomas finally moved. He didn't stand. He simply raised one hand, calmly, and waited. There was a brief silence when the moderator called on him, and several heads turned. He offered no introduction, no preamble. "I'd like to ask," he said, "how many of the panelists have personally visited the site you're implying is responsible for air pollution?" A longer silence. Karen recovered first. "We're speaking on principle, not on personal anecdotes." "I'm not asking about principle," Thomas interrupted evenly. "I'm asking if anyone here has stood on that property, read the emission reports, or measured the airflow." The zoning representative shifted uncomfortably. The professor looked down at her notes. The doctor remained still. "No?" Thomas asked, then nodded once. "Then you're debating smoke like a rumor, not a fact." He didn't wait for a response. He stood quietly and left. The next day, the first official inspection order arrived, an environmental assessment to be conducted by a county-certified third party. Elise, anticipating this move, had already scheduled an independent analysis by a nationally recognized private firm. She made sure both reports would be public. The numbers couldn't be disputed. The smoker wall, despite its intimidating appearance and ideological weight, produced emissions lower than most residential fire pits in the area. It passed on every front. Temperature control, particle dispersion, carbon output. Every metric was well within compliance, but the data didn't slow the campaign. It only shifted its target. Karen pivoted from pollution to disruption. She circulated a petition about communal wellness, citing vague studies about how the presence of smoke-based traditions could negatively affect community tranquility. The language was so abstract it could have applied to anything, and yet it resonated with a certain demographic, the ones who equated peace with silence and progress with uniformity. Thomas didn't respond. He let the numbers speak. He let the walls stand. But privately, he knew something else had shifted that week. This was no longer about rules. It wasn't even about land. It was about narrative. Two visions for what a community could be. One clean, minimal, future-leaning. The other rooted, grounded, imperfect but rich in texture. And the midpoint between those visions was gone. There was no compromise. Not anymore. If there had been any lingering hope that logic or legality might diffuse the situation, it was extinguished the moment Thomas found the gate to the smoke wall padlocked with a county-tagged zip tie. No warning, no scheduled hearing, not even an email from the city. Just a thin, red plastic seal threaded through the chain of his own gate, bearing a tag that read, "Under review, access restricted." The city's insignia was stamped beneath it, along with a phone number and a case number that didn't appear in any previous correspondence. Elise's voice on the phone was as sharp as Thomas had ever heard it. "They're playing procedural brinkmanship now," she said without preamble. "Somebody pressured a temporary injunction through the Zoning Review Committee. It's technically legal, but it's dirty." He didn't need her to explain. The case hadn't changed. The structure hadn't changed. The permits were all in order, but the momentum was no longer governed by merit or compliance. It had slipped into a different arena now, one where relationships mattered more than regulations, and influence had begun to quietly outweigh evidence. Karen hadn't just mobilized a campaign. She had spent the last month cultivating allies inside municipal substructures. Her public narrative, that Thomas's smoker wall was not just a physical nuisance, but a symbol of regressive indulgence, had begun to take root in the minds of administrators more concerned with their own upward trajectories than with truth. No one wanted to be caught defending a project that could be framed as anti-environmental, even if it wasn't. Optics had overtaken objectivity. That week, the local paper published an op-ed titled "Clean Air, Clean Minds," penned by a columnist known more for high society event coverage than investigative journalism. It referenced Thomas's project in veiled terms, describing a sprawling outdoor cooking structure masquerading as culture while disrupting the very air we breathe. There were no facts, no sources, just a string of emotionally charged phrases, designed to elicit discomfort. It wasn't designed to inform. It was designed to corrode. Then came the petitions, first digital, then physical. One circulated among school parents warning that children walking near the parkland could be exposed to carcinogens and undesirable culinary propaganda. Another pushed for a temporary moratorium on all non-electric outdoor cooking within 2 miles of the lake, citing elevated respiratory risk during peak allergen months. The absurdity of it might have been laughable, if not for the real consequences that followed. Overnight, Thomas's public support began to fracture. Some neighbors who had once stopped by the wall now sent polite messages expressing concern about the direction things were taking. A local food blogger who had planned to write a feature on the wall withdrew, citing community sensitivities. Even vendors started pulling away. One of his oldest wood suppliers suddenly claimed a shortage and ceased delivery, though Thomas later discovered they had taken a contract with one of Karen's business partners to provide reclaimed materials for a vegan outdoor cafe being developed just outside the community, and yet the wall still stood. Locked, silenced, but not broken. Thomas kept the grounds clean, the beds trimmed, the herbs watered. He walked the perimeter every morning like a sentry guarding a relic. Elise continued filing appeals, but the legal process was deliberately slow now, dragged out through pending reviews, clarification requests, and interagency coordination. The more they delayed, the more they hoped he'd give up. But Thomas didn't fold. He'd seen pressure campaigns before, more sophisticated, more ruthless, and he knew that beneath the posturing, Karen and her circle were banking on exhaustion. They wanted erosion, not confrontation. They wanted him to wake up one morning and decide it wasn't worth it. So he changed tactics. He began making calls, not to media, not to lawyers, but to old industry contacts. Not flashy names, not high-profile influencers, but regional preservationists, culinary historians, and operators of small-town smokehouses who understood that tradition wasn't about grandstanding. It was about survival. Quietly, without press releases or marketing, he invited a few of them to visit the wall. Not to cook, just to walk it, see it, understand what it represented. Most of them left without saying much. But within a week, Thomas began receiving short, purposeful emails. One offered a donation, another asked if they could replicate the wall's schematic. A third sent a photograph of a similar structure being built in South Carolina under the name Smoke as Memory. Elise saw it immediately for what it was. "This is narrative reversal," she said. "They painted you as a relic. Now you're becoming a pioneer." But the wall still couldn't function, and Karen, sensing that her window to shut it down entirely was narrowing, made her next move. The noise complaint came at 2:11 a.m. A formal police report filed by 3 residents claimed unauthorized late-night activity on Thomas's property. When the officers arrived, they were tense, subdued, not accusatory, but clearly expecting confrontation. Thomas, calm and barefoot, opened the door, explained that no cooking had taken place for over a week due to the lockout order, and offered them access to security footage if needed. They declined. The report, they said, would be marked as unconfirmed, but the complaint itself would remain on record. It was a paper trail, and it would be used. Later that week, Thomas found a man photographing the wall. Not city personnel. No uniform. Just a stranger with a long-lens camera and a clipboard, standing on the public path that curved near the far edge of the property. When Thomas approached, the man introduced himself as a private consultant doing environmental assessments for community partners. He refused to say who had hired him. He refused to leave. Thomas didn't argue. Instead, he took a photo of the man, then called Elise. Within hours, a cease and desist was filed for unauthorized data collection on private land. The man didn't return, but the message was received. They were probing now, looking for any weakness. And then the message turned physical. It was a Wednesday morning when Thomas noticed the mulch had been disturbed along the back edge of the rosemary beds. At first, he assumed it was raccoons, but as he got closer, he saw it wasn't digging. It was placement. Neatly arranged across the base of the wall, just beneath the lowest vents, were 3 small bundles wrapped in butcher paper. Inside each was a piece of meat, charred, scorched to black, covered in what looked like powder. He touched none of it. He didn't need to. He called the police and let them handle it. The report was vague. Unauthorized placement of organic materials. No fingerprints, no surveillance footage captured the moment. But Elise knew what it meant. "They're trying to paint you as careless," she said. "They're planting the idea that you're dumping waste illegally, that your wall is a health risk, not just a nuisance." The situation was beyond repair now. The social contract that had once allowed polite disagreement had been shredded. Karen had escalated beyond legality. She was entering the domain of suggestion, implication, and theatrical provocation. Thomas responded the only way he knew how, by going quiet. For 2 weeks, he didn't post, didn't host, didn't argue. The gate remained locked. The wall remained clean. He refused interviews. He didn't respond to provocations. And slowly, predictably, the narrative began to buckle. People began asking why he hadn't fought back. Had they gone too far? Was it really about health, or was it about control? Even a few of Karen's former allies began to step away. Not in protest, but in silence. The kind of silence that happens when people realize they may have stood on the wrong side of something larger than they understood. And then Elise delivered the blow. A private foundation based in Georgia, dedicated to preserving Southern culinary heritage, had submitted a formal request to designate the wall as a regional cultural site. It wasn't binding, it wasn't even enforceable yet, but it had teeth. It came with media weight, grant eligibility, and legal leverage. Karen would have to fight not just a man with a smoker now, but a growing network of institutional legitimacy that didn't care about her lifestyle branding or investment trajectory. And that's when the final escalation arrived, an anonymous call to the fire marshal's office alleging unregistered hazardous material storage on site. This time, the visit came with full gear, helmets, infrared scanners, chemical sensors. Thomas let them in, silent, calm. They found nothing. They issued no warnings. But the intent was clear. Force a shutdown through intimidation. But Thomas didn't blink, because now the stakes had moved beyond property. This was history. This was survival, and the war was no longer private. The hearing was scheduled with less than 72 hours' notice, slipped into the city docket under the category of Emergency Zoning Irregularity Review, a designation typically used for infrastructure failures or public health threats, not culinary installations built with permits and reviewed exhaustively by 2 independent environmental firms. Or Elise was furious but composed. She had seen this kind of manipulation before, sudden procedural moves designed not to render judgment, but to provoke fatigue and confusion, often timed when opposition was unprepared or under-resourced. But Thomas wasn't under-resourced. He had time, he had representation, and most of all, he had clarity. They weren't trying to win legally. They were trying to win symbolically, by creating a moment that made it appear as if the wall was dangerous, disruptive, or both. It didn't have to be true. It just had to be said under the right lights. The night before the hearing, Thomas walked the wall in silence. It wasn't a farewell, but a ritual. He checked the mortar joints, the vent seams, the drain points. He ran his hand along the cedar panels between chambers and checked the herb beds for signs of tampering. Everything was in place, but it didn't feel like enough. This wasn't a conflict of compliance anymore. It was a clash of visions, of who got to decide what belonged in a neighborhood, what counted as culture, and who had the right to bring their past into the present without permission. Karen had turned her campaign into a mirror, reflecting everyone's unease about change, control, and community. And, if she succeeded, it would tell every homeowner in every planned development exactly where the line now stood. Cook quietly, think quietly, live quietly, or expect to be erased. The hearing took place in a municipal chamber designed more for budget approvals than ideological battles. A thin carpet lined the floor. The chairs were rigid, and the air conditioning hummed just loud enough to drown out the nuances of speech. On one side sat Karen's team, 2 attorneys in gray suits and a man introduced as a consultant in sustainable neighborhood transitions. They wore concern like a uniform, composed but vigilant. Karen sat behind them, hands folded in her lap, expression unreadable. On the other side, Elise adjusted her blazer, flipped through a thin folder, and nodded once to Thomas before standing. Her voice was steady, not theatrical, but unmistakably surgical. She began by restating the foundation's timeline, when the property was acquired, how permits had been filed, what regulations had been met or exceeded. Then she presented the 2 environmental reports, placing copies in front of the zoning board and summarizing their findings with precision. No violations, no anomalies, not even close to a breach of acceptable levels. Then she addressed the complaints, methodically dismantling them, one by one, using timestamps, witness statements, and city records that revealed several had come from individuals with no proximity to the property whatsoever. When the consultant tried to interrupt with a reference to cumulative community stress, Elise cut him off, not with rudeness but with cold, legal authority. Emotional discomfort is not grounds for zoning revocation, she said simply. You'll need to cite precedent. Karen's attorneys pivoted to their final argument, that the wall, regardless of legality, represented an incompatible aesthetic in a community committed to future-focused living. They called it obtrusive, intimidating, outdated. They questioned its permanence, its symbolism, even its architecture, arguing that it disrupted the design language of the neighborhood. It was absurd on the surface but dangerously effective in tone. They weren't attacking Thomas. They were attacking the very presence of any structure that didn't fit a curated narrative. The board listened carefully, too carefully. Then they asked if Thomas had anything to add. He hadn't planned to speak. Elise had advised against it. But in that moment, as the room teetered on the edge of quiet erasure, he stood, not to argue, not to dramatize, but to define what was actually at stake. His voice was lower than expected, but firm. This wall isn't a protest. It's not nostalgia. It's not even personal, he said, eyes meeting each board member. It's preservation of method, of memory, of the simple act of feeding people over fire in a way that built communities long before anyone thought to pave a driveway. He paused, not for effect, but for honesty. If that's incompatible with the future, he continued, then I'd like that stated in writing, clearly, so that every person in this city who builds something with their own hands, who passes down a tradition, knows exactly where they stand. Because if this gets erased today, so does the idea that culture is something living, something earned. The room held still. No applause, no protest, just stillness. The board recessed for deliberation. 45 minutes passed. Elise didn't speak. Thomas sat motionless. Karen stared at her phone. When the members returned, their statement was brief. The injunction was lifted. The property remained compliant. No additional restrictions would be imposed. Karen said nothing. She gathered her notes and left before the final sentence was even read. But the war wasn't just legal anymore. That afternoon, 3 news crews showed up, uninvited, unannounced, clearly tipped off. One asked Thomas for a statement. He declined. The wall spoke louder than he ever could, and it wasn't done speaking. The zip tie was cut by a city worker before sunrise. No ceremony, no announcement. Just the quiet snap of plastic and the swing of an iron gate as it opened freely for the first time in weeks. Thomas didn't say anything when he saw it. He simply stepped onto the gravel path, checked the latch, and opened the smoker nearest the entrance. Inside, the racks gleamed. Clean, unused, but waiting. He placed the first oak log on the fire grate with the same precision he'd used 30 years earlier when launching his first cold chain logistics hub. He wasn't rushing. He was reactivating. Word spread slowly at first. A few neighbors stopped by, some bringing curiosity, some bringing apology cloaked in casual conversation. One older man, who hadn't spoken more than a nod since the petition debacle, walked the wall with him in silence, then left without saying anything more than, "Glad it's open again." But as the smoke rose again, in smooth, even, ribbons filtered through regulated vents, something changed. Not dramatically, not publicly, but quietly. The judgment that had once attached itself to the smell, the suspicion, the politicized discomfort, no longer stuck. People didn't forget what had happened. They just stopped needing to pick a side. Karen disappeared from the neighborhood in increments. First, her assistants were seen packing up office supplies from the garden shed she'd converted into a project station. Then, one by one, her eco-installation signs were removed from community bulletin boards. When her property was listed on the market, no statement was made. But the message was clear enough. She wasn't chased out. She just lost the narrative. Thomas didn't celebrate. That wasn't his way. He hosted a small private dinner at the wall the week after the final ruling. Just 12 guests, including Elise, the environmental technician who had stood by his data, and 2 of the chefs who had visited quietly during the worst weeks of the campaign. There were no speeches, just food, stories, and the low hum of fire doing what it was always meant to do, the kind of communion that didn't require permission or agenda or approval. Months passed. The wall became less controversial, more integrated. A school field trip visited one morning, led by a culinary history teacher who wanted students to understand smoke as more than residue. A traveling writer mentioned it in a column about resistance through craft, and within a season, several regional preservation groups had expressed interest in hosting workshops on site. Thomas didn't build an empire. He didn't franchise. He didn't monetize the moment. He kept it local, personal, deliberate. The neighborhood changed, too, not dramatically but measurably. The silence that once policed expression softened. Neighbors stopped reacting to difference as disruption. A few even hosted their own modest cookouts, reclaimed their yards, took back small corners of their lives that had been too carefully managed for too long. The wall didn't just withstand pressure, It altered pressure itself. Elise, when asked later what had made the difference, gave a one-sentence answer. He didn't flinch. And she was right. Thomas hadn't shouted. He hadn't pleaded. He hadn't crumbled under process. He had simply held his line, stone by stone, chamber by chamber, smoke thread by smoke thread. In the end, it wasn't about victory. It wasn't about winning a feud. It was about proving that permanence doesn't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes it just needs to stand. Smoke, after all, is fleeting, but what it represents doesn't have to be. And in Lakewood Shores, long after the last embers of that first reopened fire faded, people still remembered the scent, not as a nuisance, but as a turning point. A reminder that history, when tended properly, can still burn clean.